This video will cover section 1.4 on the topic of completing the square. Now up to this point we've talked about two ways to solve quadratic equations. The first way being the zero factor property, the second way being the square root property. Now the zero factor property will only work if your quadratic expression is factorable. The square root property we use when we're missing the x term, and so all we have is x squared and the constant. And it's just faster than using other methods. Now, what happens when I can't factor my quadratic expression to solve the equation? Then I have to use some other method. And one of those methods that we can use is completing the square. And it works for all quadratic equations, whether they'll factor or not. It's a method that always works. Now, these 5 steps are what you'll do. We're going to look at mainly completing the square where a does equal 1, which are a little bit easier to solve. However, if you do have where a doesn't equal 1, so you have ax squared, then what you're going to do is divide each side of the equation by that a. So everything gets divided by a. And then we'll rewrite the equation so that the constant term, and remember that's the c, is alone on one side of the equal sign. Once we do that, we'll take half of the coefficient of x, which is b, so we'll take half of b, and then we'll square that half, and that number will add to each side of the equation. That results in a perfect square trinomial on one side, and we can factor it and then use the square root property. So let's look at a couple of examples. Alright, if I have x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0, I want to solve it by completing the square. So I notice that my a is a 1, so I don't have to divide by anything. So I'm going to take x squared plus 2x, and I'm going to move the 15 over to the other side. And you can add 15 to both sides, or think of it as I'm going to take negative 15 and move it over to the other side of the equal sign. And so when I cross the equal sign, my number changes signs from negative to positive. Alright, then that brings us to square half the coefficient of x. So we're going to take the coefficient of x, which is 2, and take half of it. You can do that by either dividing by 2 or multiplying by 1/2. Alright, which gives us 1, and then we square that, which is also 1. So now I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Alright, now I have x squared plus 2x plus 1, which is a perfect square trinomial, meaning I can say a binomial times itself to give me this trinomial. And these are real easy to factor. You always just take the variable, then whatever you got when you took half. So when I took half of 2, I got a positive 1, and then you square it. Alright, so then 15 plus 1 is 16. Now I have an equation that's set up to where I can use the square root property to solve it. I have a squared term on the left, and then I can take the square root of the number on the right. Alright, so we'll do that. Now we'll take the square root of this side. Now remember, with the number you do plus or minus until we know more about what this equation deals with. So then when I take the square root of this side, I get x plus 1. And then the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. Alright, I still need to solve for x, so I'm going to subtract 1. Alright, and this tells me that x can equal 4 minus 1, and x can equal negative 4 minus 1. Alright, and this equals 3. And negative 4 minus 1 equals negative 5. Alright, remember you can check your answers by filling both of these back into the equation and verifying that you get a 0 on the left side also. So 3 squared would be 9. 2 times 3 is 6. 9 plus 6 is 15. Minus 15 is 0. And then you could do the same thing with negative 5. Also, feel free to use your calculator to check those answers if you need to. Alright, here's an example where a does not equal 1. So in this case, what we would want to do is go through and divide everything by 10. Alright, and so when I do that, I'll get x squared plus 1/10 x minus 1/5. Go ahead and simplify your fractions. Remember, no decimals. Alright, so now that I've gotten rid of that a in front, that 10, I can proceed as usual. So we'll say x squared plus 1/10 x equals 1/5. So I took my constant and moved it across the equal sign to the other side. Now I'm going to take my b, which is always the coefficient of my x term, and I'm going to take half of it. Alright, and you can either divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2, whatever is easiest for you. Since it's a fraction, I'm going to multiply by 1/2, and I'll get 1/20. Alright, now I'm going to need that 1/20 again, so remember it. Alright, and then we square it. So the b term, half of it, and then we're going to square it. Alright, so that'll give me 1/400, which I'm going to add to both sides. Then I can factor this right side. Remember, it's always the variable, and then what I got when I took half, so that's plus 1/20. And when I took half, if I got a negative number, then that would be minus. And then I can add 1/5 using my calculator. 1/5 plus 1/400. I have to enter. Alright, will give me 81/400. Alright, so now that I have it set up where I can use the square root property, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. This will leave me x plus 1/20. I don't know why I put those parentheses there. Equal to the plus or minus. The square root of 81 is 9, and the square root of 400 is 20. Then to solve for x, I'm going to subtract 20. Alright, this gives me x equals negative 1/20 plus or minus 9/20. And then I can put those together. Come up here and do that. So we'll have negative 1/20 plus 9/20 would give me 8/20, which will simplify, both divisible by 4 to 2/5. And then we have negative 1/20 minus 9/20 will be negative 10/20, which will simplify to negative 1/2. Alright, and then this would be an excellent problem to check my answers using the calculator. Alright, so I'll store 2/5 in x, and then I'm just going to type in my function here, 10x squared plus x minus 2, and verify that I get 0. Let's see. We do, so I know 2/5 is a good answer. Now let's try negative 1/2. We'll store it in x, and then I'm going to recall my function, hit enter, and I get 0, so I know negative 1/2 is also a good answer.